Transfiguration is at the heart of the message of the gospel. I don't mean necessarily today's event of transfiguration. I mean the idea of transfiguration, the substance of it. In definition, it means to change the appearance of something to make it more beautiful or more holy. And in today's passage, this piece of scripture we read from Luke gets labeled the transfiguration because that's what happens to Jesus. The disciples are used to walking the dusty roads with him and eating and drinking and just seeing his humanity. But in this moment on the mountain, he's transfigured and his divinity overwhelms his humanity. It shines forth from him in an undeniable way. You get the extra bonus of 2 prophets from the Hebrew tradition, and a voice from heaven says, "This is my son, my chosen." And so there can be little doubt about who Jesus is for the 3 disciples who were on the mountain. In the Gospel of Luke, the whole event takes place in the context of prayer. Jesus regularly goes off with a couple of his disciples to pray. Jesus needs the silence and the solitude to recenter so he can be who he needs to be with the crowds. And he takes the disciples with him to model what that looks like. It's part of their habit. It's part of the pattern of their life together. And so Jesus just goes to the mountain that he goes to with his disciples to pray. And it's then that this encounter happens. In Matthew and Mark, Jesus seems to take his disciples and know that the transfiguration is going to happen. But in Luke, it seems like it's a moment of grace and gift and unexpected encounter. And the encounter is for all of them. Jesus is about to set his face towards Jerusalem. After this moment, he begins walking towards what will be the cross event. And in this moment, there's something about his talking to Moses and to Elijah, 2 prophets associated with the end times, that perhaps sustains him in his journey. They talk about what's going to happen, the difficulties of it. But they also talk about the kind of end he's going to bring to sin and to death and to separation from God. And just like the baptism, which is often compared to the transfiguration, in which Jesus' identity is confirmed, a voice speaks, "You are my beloved Son." The voice is only for Jesus at the baptism in Luke. And it sustains him for his ministry. This moment of glory sustains him as he walks to the cross. There's also a moment for the disciples. Unlike the voice at the baptism, this voice is for them. "This is my son, my chosen." Pay attention. The disciples see and now understand in undeniable ways that this is the Messiah. And it changes them. They leave the mountain and they don't say anything to anybody. And I wonder if that's because they don't know how to put the experience into words. The deepest spiritual things that happen to us are so intimate, they're so personal. To try to speak them robs them of some of their power. And so for a long time, the disciples stay silent, but there's only 3 of them. And this makes it into the 3 Gospels that are similar. So they definitely told somebody. And it was so important, it must have shaped how they saw all that Jesus did. It also prefigures the resurrection, when the glory of God will be fully manifest as Jesus rises from the grave. And so the transfiguration, like all spiritual moments, all thin places, is over. It's transitory. And they come back down the mountain and go back about the ministry business that is Jesus, work in the world. But this is a second transfiguration story. We don't often call it that, but that's what it is. A man brings his son who has a demon or who has seizures, however you want to interpret it, and he needs Jesus' help. He's gone to the disciples, who notably were empowered to heal people like several chapters before, and so Jesus' frustration is most likely aimed at them, not this man. And he heals this boy. What a beautiful moment of transfiguration. He's healed. He's made whole. What could be more beautiful than that? What could be more spiritual than ending the fracture that is destroying this young man's life? And so Jesus is transfigured on the mountain before his disciples, but Jesus spends his life doing acts of transfiguration for others. So the story really invites us to think about two kinds of transfiguration. That in our lives, God is constantly being transfigured for us. That none of us has the answer about God. I get up here every week, mostly every week, and talk about God, but it's not like I have the answer either. God is constantly coming to us and finding us maybe in our moment of prayer. Maybe when we're out in the world and something catches us. Maybe in our grief. And we see God in a new way. Something about the way we understand God is transfigured, and our faith changes in that moment. Something more beautiful about God is revealed, something more holy. And God is not the same for us, and neither are we. It's a moment of transfiguration. We never fully grasp God. These moments, they come to us throughout our journey, the thin spaces, the moments we wonder if they even happened, and maybe we don't talk about them because they're so close to our hearts. How would we put it into words? But they're so very real, and we're not the same, just like the disciples aren't the same. But then there's another kind of transfiguration that's always happening, the one that happens to us and the one that happens in our world. The kind of transfiguration Jesus lived out when he healed that boy, when he made the blind to see, when the woman at the well was brought back to her community. What a beautiful healing of fracture. When the lepers were not only healed, but for the first time in their lives get their humanity acknowledged. That's a transfiguration. And the invitation is that we are being transfigured. Paul, in his writing today, which it's a complicated argument that Paul's making, and it resonates a little anti-Semitic these days, so we're not going to go there. But in the middle, he talks about that we are being transfigured from glory into glory. That we are more and more being transfigured into the image of Christ our entire lives. That at our baptisms, we say we're in for transfiguration, yes to what God is doing in our hearts and in our minds. And the resurrection tells us who we will be. But the Son of God became a person, so we can all become sons and daughters of God, not because we're holy, but because God is. And it's God's decision to make us into the image of Jesus Christ. And in the middle of our transfiguration, it happens slowly, it happens steadily. But if we look back, we're not the same as 2 years ago, or 5, or 10, or 20 years ago. God has been working in us to grow something new, to heal our fractures, to bring us to the beautiful wholeness that God imagines for all of us. But it's not as if just only the baptized are invited into transfiguration. The Spirit of God is present in all of creation, in all people, in all places, working to bring the beautiful and the holy into places that are grief-filled and dark and aching. That's what the business of God is about in the world. Transfiguration of all things, in all time, and in all places. And so I think as we gather this week, as tanks roll into Kyiv, and as Afghans starve to death, and as our own communities are riven by conflicts about masks and vaccinations and curriculum and race and climate change, and as our families suffer from cancer or mental illness or domestic abuse or grief, either ourselves or our friends and our families, the question is, what is transfiguration right now? Not just a story from Scripture, but do we believe in its possibility today? I don't mean believe in a kind of like rose-colored glasses, naivety, or like a Hallmark holiday film. I mean like, do I give my heart to it? That credo. That I give my heart to the promise of transfiguration. Because it's not just a possibility. The resurrection reminds us that it's a promise. And do we believe that our work for good in the world, that any moment of love, of truth, that when we fall to our knees and pray for peace, do we give our hearts to the fact that it does make a difference? And even if we never see it, do we give our hearts to the fact that it matters? That our faith isn't silly? It's not naive to believe in transfiguration. It is the foundation of our hope and our trust in God. Do we give our hearts to it? I think what I love most about Luke's passage of the Transfiguration is that it happens unexpectedly. That it's a moment of prayer that is always happening for the disciples and Jesus, and yet the grace and gift of God bring about a transfiguration, and no one is the same. And I suppose it's my prayer this Sunday, in the difficulty of it all, and maybe it's just where I stand, and I'm projecting onto you, but I pray for the promise of transfiguration, that I and all of us are able to give our hearts to it. And that sometime soon, this week, maybe the next, transfiguration finds us. The power and the promise and the possibility of it becomes visible in our lives. And so, as those at the end of our text proclaim, we too would find the strength to raise our voices and be astounded absolutely at the greatness of God once more.